Order.
Mr. Speaker.
Order. Dr. Russell Norman.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker. Tēnā koutou to the people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Tēnā koutou to all New Zealanders who love our country and our people and who want to protect this place and look after each other. The Green Party shares that love and we are in this place to serve you. Today the Prime Minister has foreshadowed the black hole budget. A black hole dug into the heart of our most precious land and a black hole opening up in our most vulnerable communities. John Key told Kiwis that they will have to work harder and longer with fewer holidays and that they will pay more for everything. And in exchange for this effort, we will have to give up the integrity of our most beautiful, precious and beloved conservation estate. There is no vision for a smart economy that looks after the prosperity of people and the natural environment. There is only a corporate statement of intent. On the bright side, this year there will be new heroes in Aotearoa. Kiwis will work together once again to protect our most vulnerable citizens. There will be new champions of the environment working together alongside the Green Party to stop the bulldozers from digging up our land. John Key's proposed reforms...
Order. I apologise to Dr. Russell Norman. Could I just ask members, please, to show a little courtesy to Dr. Norman? There are so many loud discussions going on in the House. I'm struggling to hear Dr. Norman. It's unfair. I'd just ask the House to show a little more respect. If members do want to hold loud discussions, please move into the lobbies, not do it on the benches here. Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. John Key's proposed reforms for our tax system may encourage GDP to grow, but they will do little to promote prosperity. While the Greens welcome the government's commitment to do something about speculation on housing, the fairest way to achieve this is through a capital gains tax excluding the family home, just like nearly every other OECD country. The government's failure to commit to this is gutless. It will entrench inequality between those who work for wages and those who live off capital gains. A capital gains tax is broad and a highly progressive tax. It would help to reduce inequality. It would also raise an additional $4.5 billion, giving the government considerable scope to pay off debt and invest in good things like health and education. On the other hand, raising GST, as the government proposes, entrenches inequality and does not broaden the tax system. Those who are poorest will be hit hardest. This is using increased taxes on the poor for tax cuts for the rich. Large-scale tax avoidance is one of the reasons John Key is talking about tax reform this afternoon. Yet he makes no mention of the most obvious response, strengthening tax enforcement. Tax is the price we pay for living in a civilised society, but it seems that a lot of extremely wealthy individuals and companies don't want to pay their way. They want to bludge off everyone else. The overseas-owned banks were caught stealing billions from New Zealand taxpayers, and yet not one of their executives or advisors is behind bars. So if a taxpayer steals $1,000 from a bank, they get put in jail, but if a bank steals $1 billion from the taxpayers, then they just pay it back if they get caught and nobody goes to jail. Now, the Tax Working Group has reported that only 1/2 of a sample of 100 of the highest wealth families in the country are paying the top tax rate. That's wrong. National's response to tax avoidance by the very wealthy isn't to say that their donors should pay their share like everyone else. No, it's to say that we must be charging them too much tax. That's why they're avoiding it. And so we should charge them less and cut the top tax rate. It's a new kind of three strikes policy. If you get caught avoiding tax 3 times, then we'll cut the tax rate. What we need is tax reform that moves our economy in a green direction. We need ecological tax reform, like a resource rental on use of fresh water by irrigators, so that we encourage the efficient use of water. We need tax reform that encourages genuine prosperity and equality rather than rewarding tax avoidance. And prosperity is what we seek. Last week I paddled the Taumarere and Kawakawa rivers as part of my Dirty Rivers rafting tour. And as I made my way across those rivers, still degraded in spite of the efforts of Hapu and others to clean them up, I had pause to think, is this prosperity? Is a river that is so full of silt and excrement that even mullet barely survive, is this prosperity? Is it prosperity when the seagrass beds are smothered to extinction by silt, seagrass beds that are nurseries of the snapper? Sure, intensive dairying increases GDP and it's been growing at 4% a year for a decade. But what about those who can no longer catch a feed off the rocks because the snapper fishery is depleted by the killing of the seagrass? Their loss is not counted in those GDP numbers showing great growth. If anything, the fact that people now have to go to the supermarket to buy a snapper adds to GDP by adding to economic turnover. In fact, the absurd truth is that people catching a fish for free are contributing nothing to GDP. They are a kind of economic trader by refusing to participate in the mantra of GDP growth, by refusing to purchase their kaimoana. Polluted rivers increase GDP, but do they make us more prosperous? No, they do not. Let's hang on to the things that make us prosperous rather than destroy them to increase GDP and make a few people rich. On Saturday, up at Waitangi, the kids spent the day jumping into the water off the bridge leading to the treaty grounds. They were having a wild time. They were enjoying a real and tangible form of prosperity and freedom and contributing absolutely nothing to GDP. Kids used to swim in our rivers and streams all over Aotearoa, New Zealand, and in some places they still do. But in lots of places the rivers have been sucked dry for irrigation and filled with human and animal excrement. Those kids go to the local swimming pool instead of the local swimming hole. Now, swimming pools cost money to build and maintain, and they definitely contribute to GDP. The kids with polluted rivers and creeks, the kids without the freedom to swim in the river who are forced to go to the pool, are definitely making a contribution to Labor and National's dream of GDP growth. While those trader's kids swimming off the beach at Waitangi were contributing absolutely nothing to GDP, they were simply enjoying the genuine prosperity given freely by nature. Let's hang on to the things that give us prosperity rather than sacrifice them to the great god of GDP growth, while many lose a taonga and a few get very rich. Today, John Key has confirmed the worst fears of thousands of New Zealanders, that his government is gearing up to dig up our national parks. His speech is about trying to increase GDP growth, not prosperity, and the only way he can pay for it is by digging up our conservation estate. He's going to dig New Zealand into a hole that we can't get out of, a hole of inequality and environmental destruction from which there will be no escape. Our conservation land contains some of New Zealand's most treasured places. We treasure it because of its water, forests, plants, birds and animals, not because of what's under the ground. John Key's government has consistently cut conservation funding and made it harder to protect those places. Now he has the gall to tell us that putting some mining money into a conservation fund, a fund just like the one the Green Party already established and that he cancelled, he says, to quote, "This means that if there's an increase in mining activity, New Zealand's natural environment will be improved." Now that is a line that only George Orwell could have written. In order to save the environment, we have to destroy it. It's not true. New Zealanders will see through it. Another growth industry in New Zealand is motorway building. Labor embarked on what Michael Cullen called New Zealand's biggest road building project, and the new National Act Māori Party government is intent on building even more, over $10 billion on new state highways in the next decade. As we grow the motorways, we're also growing the kilometres travelled by car and trucks in New Zealand, and hence New Zealand's greenhouse emissions and use of imported fossil fuels. So not only will our children inherit the bill for this motorway obsession, but they will also inherit high greenhouse emissions and a very high dependence on fossil fuels, just when we need to be cutting greenhouse emissions and fossil fuel prices are going to increase. Another leading growth industry in Aotearoa, New Zealand is imprisoning people and building prisons. On a per capita basis, we lock up more people than pretty much anyone except the United States. But does building more prisons and locking more people up make us safer and more secure? No, it does not. Societies with higher rates of imprisonment do not have higher levels of security and a feeling of safety. The United States is a daily example of this basic truth. There is one thing we know which works to make our society safer and more secure